Lyndi Clement was brought up in Aldershot, Hampshire, UK. When this story was written in the early 90s, Lyndi was married to an artist and had 4 children, and they lived in the southwest London. Occasionally, when she was being driven down the road, for some strange reason, she would mentally find herself sitting in a horse-drawn carriage. She would look outside and see her surroundings as they would have been 200 years previously. She could even feel the wind blowing and the bumpy road from the carriage. There were dogs barking along with the sounds of horses' hooves, and people were shouting. She could see beggars walking the streets and all of the various odours. But this was not a one-off event. She'd experienced it regularly all her life. She always felt she was not in the right period, and something was wrong. Lyndi's father was in the army, and she was an only child, and was mostly brought up by her grandparents. She went to boarding school, which she hated. Lyndi never felt that her strange and almost hallucinatory dreams were a fantasy to make up for being an only child. Since childhood, she always felt drawn to the 18th century and any objects from that period. If she visited old houses, especially from the Georgian period, she sensed that she'd been there before. If she was in Piccadilly Circus, London, an image would appear to her where she would see them as they originally were, before any of the new constructions had been built. Many years before, she had joined a group of like-minded individuals where they discussed philosophy and the meaning of life and liked to meditate together. She was attracted to one particular member of the group called Sylvia, who also felt that she'd lived a previous life. It just so happens that Sylvia was able to conduct regressions using a deep relaxation technique, so at their next group session, Lyndi was regressed. They were able to determine that her name was Elizabeth Boyle. She was asked about her family, and she said she had a brother called Richard. Although he was Richard Boyle, he was also known as Lord Burlington. It turns out he was a well-known architect and philanthropist called Richard Lord Burlington, who lived from 1694 to 1753. She found she had 2 younger sisters called Juliana, who lived from 1695 to 1739, and Jane, who lived from 1696 to 1780. They had a nurse called Minns. Elizabeth was born in 1691 and died in 1751. Because the family was extremely wealthy, many records have been kept proving that the Boyle family had indeed existed. Elizabeth liked to visit places such as the gardens at Vauxhall, Bath and Tunbridge Wells. When Lyndi visited Vauxhall Gardens, a strange feeling came over her and she felt exhausted. She felt such a strong attachment to the place that she just stood there crying. The feeling was so powerful that she felt herself being transported back and could hear the music and the crunching sounds of people walking on the gravel. She could smell the flowers, especially the lavender. It overloaded her senses so much that she had to leave. When Lyndi found out about her past life family, she felt she wanted to bring them together in this life. Turns out that one of her sisters and the nurse from that life were already in her group, and sensed that it was meant to be and not a coincidence. It was after one particular regression that, after opening her eyes, she looked across at Sylvia and said, "You were my sister Juliana," and Sylvia simply responded with, "I know I was." After another session, she looked across at another member of the group, Yvonne, and said, "You were my nurse Minns," and she responded with, "I know I was, and I still care for people in this life." Yvonne was caring for the elderly in a home. Everyone in the group was so attuned to each other that one of them said they needed to meet an old man called Douglas, and that they would all get on well together. Douglas was 79 and lived in Huntingdon in Cambridgeshire, and was unfortunately confined to a wheelchair. As soon as they met Douglas, both Lyndi and Sylvia realised that Douglas was Richard from their previous life. Douglas also knew that he'd lived a previous life. They found his character was similar to Richard's, where he had an entrepreneurial spirit with a minicab business as well as a courier service, and had become wealthy. He collected paintings and loved art and architecture, landscape, gardening and travelling. His interests were exactly the same as Richard's. One day the group visited Douglas and he started to refer to them using their past life names. They were all talking as if they'd slipped back in time, and there was a complete bonding and affection between each of them. One day the four of them went to visit Chatsworth House in Derbyshire to see a portrait of themselves when they were the Boyle children. They were able to study their faces in that previous life, and when they looked at Richard Boyle and then Douglas, there was an incredible resemblance. It was as if serendipity had stepped in and was controlling their lives, and that it was meant to happen. Unfortunately, Douglas died 2 years later. They went in search of their younger sister Jane, who was a shy and quiet woman who never married, but it seems that the strange coming together of the family in this life had not extended to Jane. Maybe Jane had already died or had not yet incarnated into this life. The house they'd grown up in, called Burlington House, was now the Royal Academy in Piccadilly. She remembered where her bedroom was in Burlington House and the outlay of the inside, but she hasn't been able to get access. She remembers being knocked down by a horse at the front and the nurse and Jane fussing over her. In her current life, when she was a young girl, her grandmother would take her past Chiswick House, where she would beg to go inside, and was obsessed with it. She pictured everything as it had been in the 18th century and had images of herself lifting up her long dress and running. She had vague memories of Chiswick House being built with the scaffolding, winches, hammering and banging. In her current life, she would call the composer Mr. Handel instead of Handel, because this is what she called him when he visited their house in her past life. She remembered him as a favourite uncle and would speak to her in a German accent. In that life, she played the harpsichord and still enjoyed listening to the harpsichord in her current life. Another recurring memory is walking down Arlington Street wearing a yellow silk dress. She was alone and skipping to her dressmaker. The Boyle family also owned another house in Yorkshire called Londonsborough and was able to remember her 11th birthday party at the house whilst being regressed. Actually, today it is called Londonsborough Hall and still exists. She had married a man called Henry Bedingfield, who was Catholic, while she was Church of England, which was unusual in those days. They married on August 23rd, 1719, in St. George's, Hanover Square. They married on her 28th birthday. She'd recently walked into the church and knew she'd be married there. She also visited Littlecote House in Wiltshire, where there was a portrait of Juliana, and it was like looking at Sylvia now. She said she had a happy marriage and lived in Norfolk, and called herself Betty. She had 8 children and was surrounded by many animals, which she does in this life. She had also inherited a love of needlework in her current life, like Elizabeth Boyle. One day Lyndi and Sylvia visited Chatsworth House and came upon a box of letters from that life and were able to look at them. She immediately recognised the handwriting, and it was the same as hers today. Elizabeth Boyle died at Augsburg in March 1751 at the age of 59, and says she remembers being ill in bed but does not remember dying. She met the current Henry Bedingfield and was able to get access to the family vault, and was able to stand on her own grave. She had a mixture of happiness and sadness, but most of all wanted to be transported back to that time.